All right, I think we're 5 minutes past. Maybe we should just get started and then people can trickle in. Of course, this whole session is obviously going to be recorded. So you guys, for those of you who are not able to make it live, can also watch it after the fact. Of course, we won't be able to answer. I mean, we can still answer. You'll have to email us your questions after the fact. But we're going to have a drawing at the end for Alex's book on NLP and scaling NLP. So if you guys want to just post, say hi or something, so we'll know who attended today, so we can actually pick from the people who actually attended. That'll also be good. So go ahead and sort of just post something and hi, introduce yourself on the chat, so we can just pick from your names for the book the book drawing, and we'll announce the winners over email later. Cool. All right, let's get started. Once again, thanks everyone for joining this webinar. We're going to be talking about how do you discover insights from scientific literature using NLP, and specifically, how do you build a knowledge graph using NLP? The next slide. So the agenda itself for today is going to be, we'll talk about the problem space. Like, what are the problems inherent in biomedical data, specifically biomedical scientific literature data, and also both structured and unstructured, but basically biomedical data. And then also we'll talk about the solution phase. What does a viable solution look like? And of course, no surprises, the solution is going to involve using NLP and building a knowledge graph. And so we will talk extensively about the implementation details and the construction details about how you actually go about using NLP and knowledge graph, and also some of the applications that you can then derive from it as a downstream application, right? So and then finally we'll show you a demo of the product we built. It's called Orpheus, which actually does all of this using the COVID-19 data set. And Alex will walk through a bit of demo of that, and then finally we'll do some takeaways and next steps in terms of what we've learned so far. One warning I'll give you is hey, the thing is going to be heavily space metaphors all over the place. So I'm hoping we're all people who like space things, because we're huge fans of of everything space. So you'll see a lot of space metaphors. So hopefully don't get put off by it. Quick note about ourselves. So my name is Vishnu. I'm the CTO of Wisecube AI, and I have my good friend Alex, who's a principal data scientist, and we are part of Wisecube AI. We help accelerate life sciences R&D mainly through AI and NLP and building knowledge graphs, and on a core platform that we also have. Anyway, so if you want to know more about AI and NLP in the biomedical space and how to use all these things, come talk to us, and we'll give you all the content from later. Great. So biomedical data. So what is the problem with biomedical data itself? And in general, it could be said about a lot of different domains, but since we work extensively with biomedical data, we're sort of very focused on that. What are the main problems? In my opinion, our opinion, there's three main problems that we normally see, which is there's one, which is actually there is an explosion of data that's happening. And it's true for most fields, but especially biomedical fields, especially with the genomics revolution, with all the scientific research that's being published, with all the data that's being generated from the different activities that are happening across this space. There is a sort of a big bang of data explosion that's happening. In one sense, if you're a data scientist or data engineer, bioinformatics person, that's very exciting. But if you're a scientist just trying to understand and keep up with all the things that are going on, you can imagine it could be a nightmare, right? And so that's sort of a huge problem. There's just too much data that's being generated in some sense for humans to actually keep up with. We've crossed the threshold of that. I feel a long time ago, but especially now. And we'll focus on this, especially with the COVID example and just the research that's being published around COVID. And if we just focused on that one narrow subset of biomedical data, this whole talk is going to be about that. And we'll get into the details of that. The downside of having so much data and specifically having, all this data and sort of the insights of the data in sort of human readable form, especially scientific papers, as you can imagine, it's not very machine readable in some ways. And that's where the other problem comes in, was these insights are really hidden, and most of it is unstructured or unlabeled data. And so, not to give away, obviously this is where NLP is going to help us. The other problem, which is sort of like a paradox almost, which is like in one sense you have so much data that's being generated, but that in some ways it's not the right kind of data. It's not what we call labeled data, which, what does that mean? It's like you can't really use that and feed it into a supervised learning model or machine learning model or deep learning model and saying like, hey, give me answers, give me insights, right? It's not ready for that. And there is a step that has to happen before you can apply your favorite deep learning libraries to generate whatever models you want to sort of like do predictive or generative modeling, right? And so that's sort of the whole paradox in this field, which is, we think about like all these examples, everyone talks about like, hey, you can turn to image recognition, video recognition. In those cases, there's actually tons and tons of like labeled data because people go in there and actually label their pictures. This is a cat, this is a dog. That doesn't happen in the biomedical space. And so this is why it's a sort of a weird like dichotomy of like, it's like too much data and not enough data. And we call this sort of like dark data, right? Where it's like everything is dark. It's dark to like humans and machines in some ways. And so the whole idea is like, how can we solve this problem of like dark data where there's so much dark data? And just like the universe, and this comes back to the space analogies, just like the real universe, the majority of the matter they say is like dark matter. And so the majority of the data is dark data. And so how you actually, almost like throw a light on this and get more insights into it. And that's where the solution comes in. So if you go to the next slide, the solution, as you might have guessed, involves NLP. It involves natural language processing techniques that have been developed, both the classical techniques and also the newer sort of deep learning based techniques, and using them to sort of parse, extract, and analyze this data. And not only do that, but also sort of relate and find hidden insights between the relationships that are, that are sort of inside these sort of papers and other data sets. And once you've analyzed the data, once you've extracted what we call entities, then you sort of like all the extracted relationships, then you can start building what's known as a graph or knowledge graph, which keeps track of every concept and the relationships between different concepts and instances of these concepts in a graph form, right? And so that's, and once again, space terminology, that's sort of like our Hubble or space telescope, if you will. If you think of like the NLP itself as the lens or the mirror, the whole thing is actually what we, it's a knowledge graph application. So there's three sort of main things we think that a solution should do in order to address the problem, which is like, one, it should allow you to explore. It should allow you to just point at a given point in the space, like our universe, and saying like, I want to, explore more about that area. And that area could be like your therapeutic area, right? It could be like immunotherapy. It could be whatever your firm is actually focused on trying to develop solutions for, therapeutic solutions. And so it should allow you to explore your specific area and then analyze it, obviously, in great detail and find out hidden concepts and relationships from all possible kinds of data. It could be structured, unstructured, labeled, unlabeled. And really what I want to know is like, how can I use all of this data to be able to derive more insights, right? And then of course, learn. What do I mean by learn? I mean, like actually make predictions, actually like experiment and try things, right? And figure out what actually is going to work. I compared this to like looking for a planet that's Earth-like, an M-class planet, if you will, if you're a Star Trek fan. So looking for that, it's a needle in the haystack problem. In some ways, in drug discovery space, at least, like if you know what I'm talking about, is like it's a needle in the haystack problem where you're looking for one kind of structure, or one kind of target. So it could be target identification, it could be lead identification, it could be like adverse event prediction. There's so many use cases that then come out from actually building this kind of a knowledge graph. Right. All right. Next slide. I think that's so that's sort of like the preamble. And so I think for the next part, we're going to be talking about, okay, so how do we actually go about building such a knowledge graph application? And, and for that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex, who's going to walk you through that portion of the talk. Alex, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Vishnu. Yeah, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about how we actually do this. So the idea of taking a number of data sets of text data, structured data, and turn to a knowledge graph is a large endeavor, and it seems very complicated. But when doing it, it's actually pretty straightforward once we go through the different steps. There's always, of course, cooler, newer, more sophisticated algorithms you can implement, but it's always important in any data science thing is to get the first version done, and then you increment on it from there. And that's an important part of this pipeline, because one of the things we look at is we do the text processing, and then we do topic modeling. And that's going to let us do the exploration, because topic modeling is a good way of showing the trends and clusters in your text data. Then we do the entity extractions, which we can add in and of itself to a search engine experience. So you can go and search for documents, and you can see what entities are there. Then once we have these extracted entities, whether we've done it through models or through a dictionary-based one, we can then build the graph. But before we get there, often when you're extracting entities, it's a very popular NLP task. If you're working in a domain where there's not a lot of NLP being done, you probably won't have an NER model that you can rely on, which means you're probably going to be using a dictionary-based approach for entity extraction. However, you can bootstrap a model. It won't be, top of the line model, but it will at least be a start. So now, through a mix of models and dictionary-based approaches, you have your entities. So based off the literature and the structured data, you can construct your graph. And then from there, we can actually learn from the graph. We can try and find new edges and expand and in the graph itself to learn from the data we have. So let's talk about what a knowledge graph is, because I've been throwing that term around a lot. So this is an example of how we're doing it from articles, even though you could, the evidence here could also be from a database. So let's say we have these articles, and we have a set of documents that have COVID-19 and the ACE2 protein mentioned. And we have another set that mentioned COVID-19 and remdesivir. And we have these different sets there. Well, we can take the occurrences and the co-occurrences of these entities and turn those into weights to have a weighted graph. So here, the occurrences of COVID-19 and remdesivir, their occurrences in evidence number 2 are turned into weight 2 here. And so this creates a weighted graph for us. So now we understand that there's this relationship in the literature between COVID-19 and remdesivir, COVID-19 and ACE2 protein, and SARS and ACE2 protein. I mean, realistically, there would be an edge between COVID-19 and SARS as well, but for the example, I didn't want to have a fully connected graph. So now that we have an idea of what the knowledge graph is, let's start at the first step. What's the data we're working with? So as Vishnu said, we're using the CORD-19 data set. So it's a data set put together by the Semantic Scholar team around COVID-19. It's done in cooperation with publishers and the National Library of Medicine and some other organizations. And the actual data set itself contains articles in JSON format and a metadata file. In the metadata file, there's about 200,000 articles. It's growing every day, so don't be surprised if those numbers are out of date next week. But 200,000 some articles are mentioned in the metadata. However, there's only about 90,000 with PDFs and about 70,000 from PubMed Central. So overall, there's about 90,000 articles that are actually contained in the data set. Others you can probably retrieve through URLs. However, we stuck to just the articles that we matched up from the metadata and the actual articles in the data set. So the other data sets, the structured data we have, is based on diseases, chemicals, and proteins. For diseases, we used a website that had these list of disease names, and I manually curated a data set from that where the list is about 500 entries on that website. That's sort of an estimation on mine. And it has like other names in the different entries. And I added some Wikipedia links, and I removed ambiguous terms. So for example, if there was an entry that just said something like fever, I would just remove that, because if that was, even if that is a synonym that sometimes people use for something, it's just too ambiguous to really use in entity extraction. For the chemical data set, we used a subset from Chembl. It's about 13,000 compounds. It comes with, the data set we have comes with some synonyms and smiles strings. For the proteins, we used a subset from Uniprot, which has names and Uniprot IDs. This is the largest of the entity lists that we have, although only a small portion of these are actually found in the data. So in the Core 19 data set, there's we have in the pool of data that I built this slide around, we had about 94,000 documents. Average character length of 26,000, and they're from 20,000 different journals. So we can see also the sources there. So the majority of the plurality of them are from Medline, and then the WHO, and then PubMed Central. And they have a number of different licenses. So now let's actually work at processing our text. So I'm using Spark NLP for this. Of course, I've worked with that project since its beginning. I recently released a book on it. That's the one that, and just to remind everyone, if you wanted to just make sure you say like hello, or to put your name somehow in the chat log here, and we'll do a drawing to send someone a free copy of this. So it's an NLP library built on top of Spark MLlib. Now it has, this library comes with many pre-built pipelines and pre-built models. I end up constructing my own pipeline, and I'll go into a little bit about why, because I had some very specific needs that I had for this. So our pipeline starts with sentence tokenization, because you need to do that, especially if you're doing any sort of phrase matching, which we'll be getting into. So then I have two different tokenizers I'm using. If you look here in this flow chart, we have a more complex pipeline and a simple pipeline. And the reason why I have this simple pipeline is that when I'm doing the entity extraction, whether dictionary approached or model-based approached, I don't want to remove stop words. I don't want to lematize. Those actually might be important in matching names. And on the other hand, when I'm doing topic modeling, I do want to remove those things, because it doesn't matter if the occurs a lot in a particular topic. And furthermore, actually stop words can really cause problems in your topic modeling. But what I'm doing here is that tokenizing in the more complicated one is also removing words that are too short. I include a bunch of phrases that I want to not separate in different tokens. The normalization is also a little more different. It's a little more aggressive here on the topic modeling side of the pipeline. And I'm removing stop words, and I'm also lemmatizing. In case any of you aren't familiar, that's reducing words to their dictionary form. So for example, if you look up, cats in the dictionary, it'll direct you to cat. And if you look up stages in the dictionary, it'll direct you to stage. This is as opposed to stemming, where it would turn stage to stag, to stag. And that's like a whole another on the difference between lemmatizing and stemming. I definitely have a strong preference for stemming. But that's just the language nerd in me. So the outputs I'm getting from this are the normalized tokens from the short pipeline and the lemmas from the more complex pipeline. Whoops. I clicked on something that I should not have clicked on. Where did my slide go? There we go. There we go. Okay. So I go back to that. So after we've extracted these things, we also want to find these n-grams. That'll be important in the topic modeling. So there's a couple of different approaches you can take to finding. Okay. I thought I turned off notifications, but I'm getting Slack notifications. So there's a couple different ways you can use to get n-grams. So we're going to go over a manual process here. So in this case, you run your NLP pipeline, you get your lemmas out. You then generate the n-grams. Now, a lot of these n-grams will just be just coincidental from the particular sentence. They're not meaningful. So that means they're going to have a lower frequency in the documents. So there's another thing that's going to occur, which is there's going to be many formulaic statements. So these are things like copyright messages, links, stuff like that. And those will have a high frequency in your corpus, but you actually are not interested in those. So although those are phrases you want to capture, you also want to remove them like you would remove stop words. So you gather these frequencies, you do a manual examination of the top K. I was looking at the top 30 for each one of the N here. And then I go and add those into the tokenizer parameters. In Spark NLP, you can actually set exception phrases that are not going to be tokenized. I go and set them there and then rerun it until I feel satisfied that I've found all the phrases I want. And you can just repeat on that cycle. You can do this automatically as well, but that's going to be some danger because you're going to need to find the right cutoff. Okay, I need to stop clicking on that. There. So here we have some plots of the log mean of the TF-IDF of the different n-grams. So here we see with unigrams, we see this rather gradual drop off in the log mean. And in bigrams, it gets a little steeper, trigrams steeper still, 4 grams, very steep. Of course, if this wasn't a log, it wasn't a log mean, they would all sort of look the same, as these are very strongly power law distributed words and grams. So that means that when you're finding 4 grams, you'll probably find fewer here than in trigrams and fewer trigrams than bigrams. But you do want to make sure you look at the 4 grams first, because sometimes you'll find frequent bigrams that are actually just parts of a trigram. So now we've found our n-grams, we've generated our normalized tokens and our lemmas that we're going to be using. Let's now get into the topic modeling. So topic modeling is based off this idea of distributional semantics. So the idea is that you shall know a word by the company it keeps. So there's many different techniques used for this. WordDevac and BERT are part of this family of algorithms, are part of this field. And probably the most advanced of the pre-deep learning ones is latent Dirichlet allocation. That's the most popular one. You also frequently see people using sort of classical clustering techniques to do the same thing. The sort of benefit of that is that it's pretty easy to understand what your algorithm's doing. They're usually pretty simple, just about decomposing the matrix. Latent Dirichlet allocation is a more complicated one built on probabilistic models, and but we can use it to generate these cool visualizations using PyLDA-Viz. So this is just a static picture. Let me see if I can real quick show everyone it run here. Okay, so perfect. Well, I can. Here we go. So that notebook was working just before the presentation. Of course, it's not working now. Thus is life. So let's go on to entity extraction. So there's, as we mentioned, there's two basic approaches. There's dictionary-based extraction and model-based extraction. So dictionary-based extraction, or at least the one we're using here, uses the Aho-Korosik algorithm. It's essentially it's a tree data structure of tokens that you use to search through text without having to backtrack. That means it's a pretty efficient way to do pattern matching when you have a large number of patterns. It requires a dictionary or word list, essentially a list of names and aliases for you to use to create the tree structure. But it doesn't require any training data, right? It's just dictionary-based approach. The model-based ones, deep learning is the most common now. Conditional random fields, I'd say, were the most popular, before deep learning took over. It's probably before about 5 years ago. Even though CRFs, as they're more commonly called, are still pretty competitive and pretty useful, and don't require quite as much data to train. Though I don't think any of them have the state of the art benchmarks anymore. So the Aho-Korosik algorithm. So this is a very simple example of the tree structure that you have. So here you have the word acute, and then bacterial rhinusitis, or you can go acute rhinusitis, and they point to the same entity that we have stored in the tree. So they have the same entry there. Here we have common and cold, that points to the common cold entry. What makes Aho-Korosik efficient is that there are extra links in this tree structure, so that if, let's say, I find acute bacterial, and then the next token is infection, rather than rewinding back where I'm searching through the text, there's actually a link, maybe somewhere else in this tree, where we have bacterial and then infection, and it will search there. So I actually make only a single pass through all my text, searching for the entities. So the pro is that no training data is needed. You only need a list of names and aliases, and you're ready to go. The cons are that it will only find the entities in the alias list, and it doesn't use context, which means that you can get a lot of false positives. So, for example, there's a protein who one of its aliases is April, written in all caps. So if if you had a corpus that's talking about a global pandemic that became large in March and April, well, that's going to get a lot of false positives. So that means that you're going to have to essentially remove that alias and maybe even that protein from your data set. On the other hand, model-based approaches, they predict which tokens are part of the entity, sort of as a classifier. The benefits are that it identifies based on context. So even if you've never seen that particular disease or compound or protein before, it can potentially identify it. Also, it can be tuned to different data sets. With a dictionary-based approach, it's just, there's no actual tuning. You can adjust your text processing if you want to try, have it work a little bit better, but there's no real tuning you can do. The cons are that you need to get training data. Training data is relatively straightforward for humans to gather for most NER problems. The difficulty is that when you get to these domain-specific ones, it gets a little bit harder for just general people to find all the references in the text. And deep learning, of course, requires a lot of data, so it'll be even harder. But there's a way you can kind of get started on a model, and that is by bootstrapping. So the approach you go with bootstrapping is that you run your dictionary-based approach and you output it in bio format. So that's what we have here on the right. So here we have the influenza virus is divided into different types and subtypes. Influenza virus is an entity mention. So we have B here for the beginning of a disease reference, and we have virus because it's inside a disease reference. So now we output in the bio format. We have to make sure the tokenization is consistent between them, because if tokenization is, if you're let's say fine-tuning a pre-existing deep learning model and it expects a different tokenization, you need to be doing that tokenization for your dictionary-based approach that you're using to Bootstrap. So however you're doing it, just you have to make sure you the same tokenization and whatever text processing you're doing is the same between your dictionary-based approach and your model building approach. With conditional random fields, it doesn't require as much data. It's a simpler model. So that's sort of a double-edged sword there. It's good because it's simpler, requires less data. It's bad because it's not going to be able to learn as much. And there's also fewer open source implementations. It just you never got quite as big as the deep learning stuff, though there are good implementations out there. Deep learning, of course, that's the state of the art. It does require a large amount of data, and it can be slow to run without a GPU. Now, if you're using just Word2Vec for your vector representations, for turning your words to vectors, it won't be that slow. The difficulty comes when you're using something like BERT plus complex neural network. Then what you have is you have to run this neural network at prediction time. And if it's a very complex one, it can be much slower than other approaches. So these are some things to take into consideration when you're extracting the entities. So now we have our entities. We've done our topic modeling so people can explore the data, but now we want to talk about the graph. So there's two ways we can extract relationships. Again, heuristics and models. So models are for this are very rare. The idea of relationship extraction is not as common of a set of models out there as we find for like NER models. And creating labels requires experts. If you give someone a biomedical article and ask them, what's the relationship between these two entities in there? The average person will not be able to give a useful answer. And not only that, is that oftentimes these entities are not necessarily in one small place of the text. They can actually be scattered throughout the document, which means that not only do you require an expert, but each document will require that expert's attention. There are shortcuts and some corners you can cut around this, like you might be able to reduce your document to sections or even paragraphs and just get your labelers to answer on that. But it's generally pretty difficult and expensive potentially for gathering labels. So heuristics is sort of what we're going with now. So the idea is that these relationships are going to be in the text and we can identify them. Now, if you're trying to extract typed relationships from the text, it's complicated. And as I was saying to Dimitri earlier, different styles of language can make this very difficult. If you have very verbose language, like academic language, the way the relationships are stated can span sentences. So it'll be hard to come up with heuristics that extract different kinds of relationships. So we're going with an untyped one for when we build this model, with the idea that once we find these relationships, it'll actually be easier to create more targeted data sets to identify the relationships. So when you're doing this untyped one, you want to consider, like, what's your context? Are you doing it within the document or within the sentence? Again, the pros and cons. When you find two entities mentioned in a sentence, you know that the author is saying they are somehow connected. On the other hand, there are still probably connections if they're mentioned in the same documents. So it depends on whether you want to get fewer edges and be very confident, or get more edges and know that you might be getting some tangential or even spurious relationships. And then there's also how you want to weight them. You could not weight them. You could just look at the binary of whether they're in a certain number of documents or in one document or what have you. You could look at the count, but the problem with count is that words have different numbers of occurrences, and so you'll end up having all your most popular terms highly connected to each other, which is not going to be very helpful. So we're using TF-IDF because that's sort of a classic way of identifying how relevant a word is, or term is, in a document. well, actually, let me go back and speak a little bit more on that. So what we do is we gather the TF-IDF for each of these term document pairs. Then what we do is we look at, we use that to calculate a weighted Jacquard. So that's essentially what's the combined TF-IDF in all the documents that they occur in together. And then we divide that by the TF-IDF in all the documents that either of them occur in. And if that's 1, then that means, first of all, it means that they're referenced in the same set of documents. And the closer that is to 1, that means the more of their shared mentions dominate sort of the set of all references to them. So that gives us our initial graph that we can then go and do additional analyzing on. So now we have our graph built. Here's the full pipeline. So we come in with our corpus, we do our NLP pipeline, and that gives us our processed articles. This is our normalized tokens for entity extraction and our lemmas for topic modeling. We do the topic modeling and we save off the data that we need for LDA visualization. So like PyLDA does. We then take our normalized tokens and we do our entity extraction, whether that's Aho-Corsic with some structured data or an NER model. And we have our list of entities. So from there, we have our documents and our entities, and we can build our graph. We store that in a graph database like OrientDB or Amazon Neptune. We store our documents along with the entities discovered therein in a search index like Elasticsearch. Now we have our app. And oh, I keep on clicking the wrong thing. Okay. So now that we have this graph, we can explore the data. We can go and look at the different topics. We can go and search through the documents. So we can now look at this combined data set of structured and unstructured data. We can analyze the graph itself to find new relationships. We don't have really time to get into the idea of link prediction now, but you can essentially use the structure of the graph to find where there should be an edge, even if it's missing. And then we can learn higher level representation. So we can actually take this graph, and there are a lot of techniques in the field of sort of growing about taking a graph and producing vectors from it. What's cool about that is that if you're doing something like trying to predict compound target activation, you can actually use the vector produced from the graph as one of your sets of features. That allows you to use this literature data in other applications. So let's go take a look at the Orpheus demo. Okay. So here we have the topic modeling. It's a little different than the one I showed in the slide. We're sort of working on some of the visualizations, hence why some of the stop words are here. But here we see we have like topic 5 there, and we have the different word distributions for it. We have the recent papers that are in there, so it's sorted by date. We also have the top entities that I mentioned there. This is just looking at frequency. But now we can also go and click through. Let's go search for coronavirus. Okay, so now we have a list of documents here. We have the different entities that are also found in these documents. So here, let's see, we have a coronavirus hotspot on coronavirus disease in 2019 in India. We have a number of compounds mentioned. And let's go ahead and now click through to COVID-19. And we have our graph representation. So here we can go and these are sort of the highest by weight connections to COVID-19. We expand one of these connections. Now we have the ones brought to us by ACE2. And then here we have remdesivir, and we can say, like, okay, well, we have this connection here. Well, what's what does this connection mean? And we can look at the evidence. So if you remember all the way back to when I was talking about knowledge graphs, these are the articles that they're mentioned in. Maybe not all of them, but these are the top by their TF-IDF. So we can go and we can look at the abstracts for them. And yes, you can go and explore the data. And of course, we also have that structure that we can go and do the analyze and learn from it. So let me go back into the slides. Okay. So I'm going to hand it back to Vishnu for the wrap up.
Hey, thanks a lot, Alex, for walking us through that. Okay, so what are some of the key takeaways? Like I said, I'm just wrapping up. So basically, dark data, once again, it's like there's a ton of data out there. We want to be able to use them by both humans and also machines, and ideally combination. And we do believe NLP is the key to that. And of course, knowledge graph is the way, sort of like that is the way we think, it's going to actually unlock all of that, right? And like I said, NLP is the lens, knowledge graph is the actual telescope. And the one thing that we did notice when doing this, and we believe, is that domain-specific graphs are better than just sort of building a massive universal graph of everything. I know, like, we hear in the news a lot of these like sort of Uber models like GPT-3 and whatnot. They just throw the whole kitchen sink at it. But in our experience, at least, if you're trying to solve a specific problem, try to be focused and decide what corpus and what data sets you actually want to include, because it is going to have a big impact in terms of the downstream use cases that you can then do. Speaking of which, there's, what Alex had mentioned, there's, and this is why we're so excited about knowledge graphs, is because there's so much downstream applications to it, whether it be predictive analytics, or generative modeling, specifically in the drug discovery domain. There's things like, adverse event prediction. Well, first of all, target identification, adverse event prediction, generative modeling to come up with new compounds, or drug repurposing. Obviously, like remdesivir is another example where there's actually people are, doing this right now, where like they are taking this kind of a knowledge graph that's built, and then they're looking at existing drugs that are related to a specific disease or a specific target, a protein, right? And saying, look, hey, for COVID-19, what are the other sort of related drugs? And so you can imagine using techniques like link prediction, where we can say, actually, these things are not directly related, but they should be based on the context in which they actually reside. And so that kind of stuff is where it gets really, really exciting. And so we're going to have a whole talk, by the way, for those of you who are interested on those kinds of applications, the downstream applications that you can actually do once you've built a knowledge graph like this. And I don't think we have enough time to cover that, but that's a whole other talk that I think we'll probably announce soon. So if you're interested in sort of some of those applications and use cases, you should definitely, I've been told to say this, definitely subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more. We're going to have a lot more content that we're preparing that are on those use cases, and especially with NLP, and like if you're interested in biomedical AI in general, or AI in general, I think there's going to be a lot of content that we're going to start putting out. With that said, I think we want to give at least 10 minutes for questions. So we're going to open up for questions. The chat lines are always open, so feel free to ask any questions that we may not have covered in the talk. I tried answering some of them, just like, but yeah, let's go to questions, I guess. Alex, did you want to say anything else before we went to questions?
No, yeah, I think that's great. I can go back and look through to see what's already been asked and see what I can get to. Let's see. Hung Yi Pan talked about using NLP, particularly in the medical domain. So that's an interesting question. So I'll sort of like answer generally. An important distinction needs to be made between academic biomedical and clinical. Clinical is a very sort of difficult beast to tame, because doctors don't just have bad handwriting. They will let all aspects of language go poorly when writing, because they're just writing very fast. So you often have novel abbreviations. You have very strange syntactic structures. So that's one thing to consider if you're looking at doing any sort of syntactic parsing in clinical data, is that doctors do not often write full sentences. If you're familiar with the term from linguistics, pro-drop, so that's basically where you can drop pronouns and it's inferred from context. Doctors' writing is essentially a pro-drop version of English. They often omit the subject if it's a pronoun, because it's almost always going to be I or he or she or a third person pronoun. That's definitely one complicated thing. With academic stuff, which is what biomedical NLP looks more like, what you need to keep in mind is just sort of like the bloated nature of a lot of that language. And so you need to also, the other thing is synonyms is an important thing to look for, because people oftentimes use synonyms to make their stuff seem a little bit more original. Okay, let's see. Next question. I do have a longer version of my answer about extracting relationships from the subject verb object. In my book, I do go over it. Basically, I probably talk a little bit more at length. I don't know how much more deeper it is. I'm interested in trying to see if like this level of verbosity can be quantified. But yeah, I would say that probably the best thing I would say to do to understand if that's going to work for your data set is if you have your like a syntax parsing model, even if it's a general model, run it on a set of data and visually examine it and try and come up with like simple extraction rules. So like, oh, can I extract stuff? If you can do that on a small set of documents and you're happy with the results, it might be worthwhile to try it at large. Again, I would predict in more academic literature for that to be a lot more difficult. But yeah. So one of the ones that a lot of times when I'm playing around with data sets that I like to use for syntactic parsing, and actually for a lot of NLP stuff when I'm just initially exploring the data, NLTK is a really simple library. And that's sort of the one that I use to play around with. So if that's the approach you're thinking you want to do for a data set, I would encourage you just to do some syntactic parsing using NLTK and just see what the output is. Now let's see.
Hey, there's a question from Anand. He want to know about how we deal with updating models or decaying papers and newer papers and updating the graph itself, I think. So, yeah.
Yes. I remember that question. So how we do it? So that's going, again, this is one of those things that's going to depend on your data set. For biomedical and for life sciences, you don't want to take a strict approach to decaying older documents. You can still have very important information that's old. And that's a result of multiple things. So if you have a domain that often has siloed information. So what I mean by that is there are sub-disciplines, let's say within pharmaceutical research, where someone may have discovered something or had an insight on something, but you're searching in a slightly different domain. That insight may be old in this other subdomain. So you don't want to just decay things that are old. The more powerful weight as far as for which documents you want to consider is probably going to be some sort of relevance, depending on whether you're querying or whether you want to build a subdomain specific data set. Now, that being said, if we're doing something, if you're looking for just like the most recent research, you can just take sort of a vanilla decay thing, like, maybe, I don't know, every month you can cut all the weights in half for that document, but you will be throwing out some relevant information when you do that. Let's see.
Question from MD. Can you give examples of normalizations you used on your data?
Okay. So yeah. So I think as you responded, Vishnu, our plan is to create some notebooks to share out about building some of these knowledge graphs. I would say it is. I didn't do anything really special with the tokenizer. For the normalizer, one of the things I found is that in this data set, there were a lot of artifacts left behind from PDF parsing. So sometimes there would be like segments of LaTeX, and that's something that even like I did multiple cycles of trying to remove n-grams and trying to remove these odd tokens. There's still some of them in there. I would say that essentially doing vocabulary exploration. So get your vocabulary, calculate TF-IDF, and try and explore using these metrics. Mean TF-IDF, maximum term frequency, and variance. If you try sorting and exploring different strata of your vocabulary using those metrics, you can often find either words you think are important and maybe they're n-grams you want to preserve, or stop words that you are thinking that, oh, well, these are just like formulaic phrases or artifacts from LaTeX or HTML or what have you. As far as for lemmatization, that's another one that I think is really important if you're going to be showing the output of your normalization. The problem with stemming, although it's more aggressive in reducing your vocabulary size. If you're not a person familiar with linguistics or with NLP, you can produce words that a lot of other people will not recognize immediately. Stems are a bit of a weird and specific, a peculiar thing. So I'd say if you're going to be displaying the output of your normalization, you should definitely do lemmatization.
There's a question from MD again. How do PMI or other co-occurrence-based weighting methods compare to TF-IDF you used?
So I didn't do a broad exploration of different weighting methods. I went with TF-IDF because I figured that because one of the complicated things in NLP, and especially with something as complex as a knowledge graph is to build, when you want to decide what's the better thing, you actually have to fully build out a lot of the experience first so that you can actually understand what the user experience is. A common trap a lot of NLP projects fall into is the data scientist or software engineer gets enamored with doing the coolest, most complex thing without knowing whether that's actually going to help the product. You should always keep the product in mind, because language, sort of my go-to metaphor for this, NLP is like fishing. You need to know the depth of your fish. So you need to know what you're going for. That's your product, because you can always go deeper. You can always do something more complicated. You can always try, this new thing and that new thing. So just do whatever you can implement most readily, and then evaluate whether that satisfies the product. And if you have something that might improve it, make sure you understand why it might improve it. So I haven't done any other comparisons. I am looking forward to that.
There's a question about Kraken for knowledge graphs. I think Kraken is, my understanding is it's a graph database like OrientDB and Neptune. So
yeah, we did try that. I played around with OrientDB and Neptune. Right now I'm uploading into Neptune just because their bulk upload is a little less error prone than OrientDB's. And as a human, I find myself to be very error prone, so I went with the less error prone technology.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions about link prediction. How do you do it? Is it a reinforcement learning problem, or can we do supervised learning? And how we can actually do that. So
that's a great question. So right now we're not doing it as we're not framing it as a reinforcement learning problem. It absolutely can be framed that way. Right now we're doing it essentially by there's a paper, and I can't quite remember the full name of it now, but Vishnu, if you have like the name of the paper, if you could put it in the chat for
yes,
people.
yeah, the Cambridge paper, right? I'll put that in.
Please. Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially it has to do with like taking your graph and removing some of the edges and seeing if you can find them again. And then if you have a good set of hyperparameters for that, you then train that on your model and try and predict missing parameters. it seems like a weird or complicated task. There's a couple of ways you can actually make it pretty simple. We're using right now Deep Walk for our node, or for creating vectors from our nodes. So that's a pretty cool library. I've been enjoying using that.
And there's a couple more questions around the relationship extraction itself. How do you do it? How do you how do you use it? And then like I think Sudesh was saying like, hey, can we use deep learning methods for it to also do
so
that?
Really the complicated thing about relationship extraction is that that's actually a super vague term. So in this case, what I think what most people think for this particular product is when we say that SARS and ACE2 are related, in what way are they related? Well, it turns out that the ACE2, and I'm not a biomedical person, so I'm sorry if I butcher this, but that the ACE2 protein is used in the infection of SARS and COVID-19. And so you want to actually get that label out. Well, that's you're going to have someone write that down somewhere. You're going to have to someone say it, this is the word that represents how it's related. And that requires an expert. And if you can try and extract it purely from the text, the problem is that there's probably not going to be many texts that have a simple sentence saying what that relationship is. What you could do, and this is one potential scheme that I'm considering for gathering labels, is you do this untyped relationship. What you then do is you try and farm out this relationship to others and say like, oh, how are these things related? And one cool way you can do that is have a graph visualization that people can explore and annotate, which is, something that we're doing with Orpheus. And that will be one way you can gather labels. And then once you gather some labels and maybe find some data sets that have it, you can then start building up a good data set. So yeah, that's always going to be the most difficult thing in either going into a new domain with NLP or trying a new, trying to solve a new problem or a rarely addressed problem is labels. Ultimately, all NLP labels come from humans. So yeah.
There was another question about like, hey, who would be the end user for a tool like Orpheus? And I think I can answer this. It will be at least our initial goal is to target mostly life scientists or any kind of like anyone who's involved in the biomedical space or the life scientists. And the problem obviously we're trying to solve once again is this sort of dark data, exploding data problem where they have a research area that they're interested in following, but it's just too fast moving or too much to keep up with. And they want to be able to have a summarized view of what's going on, but also being able to explore different specific questions and then being able to do downstream like use cases like link prediction and adverse event prediction and things like that. So that's our sort of main target end user, but we are going to open up this tool as like sort of to all not just scientists, but everyone really. It's just as a beta pretty soon. So we're just making some final touches on the product. And then we're going to open it up and then we'll definitely let all of you know once that's available so you can play around with it. And then also the thing that Alex talked about is the hope is then you can actually go in and if like, let's say, there is a specific connection or you can even give feedback on like annotate parts of the graph where saying like, hey, this relationship, I think it's weird, or like actually this paper is not as important. And so as a scientist, maybe they can actually give annotations, which obviously will be useful for us to be able to retrain, our models to make it even more effective. But yeah, so stay tuned for that. We're definitely, that's like we're working hard on that to be able to actually open it up so everyone can actually use it, not just scientists really. All right. So
yeah, so I saw another question here. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Alex. Yeah.
Another question here from Hung Yipan about the named entity extraction. So you're talking about like the model-based approaches and those that will be trained from dictionary-based approaches. So the dictionary-based approach will produce a rather noisy training data set. That's because that you will miss some mentions that are like off by a letter, or that maybe you don't quite have an alias for. And as we mentioned, you'll also get plenty of false positives. But what you can do once you have a model is, again, you can start considering how are you going to gather labels. So what you can do is, and this is true for any sort of tagging-based NLP technique. So you make your tagger. You identify what context it is. So for named entity recognition, generally, it's going to be a sentence. Then what you do is you take a stratified sampling from the predictions through your data set. So for each of the sentences, so if you do your predictions, take some of like the top predictions, some of the middle predictions, some of the bottom predictions, and randomly sort them and give them to viewers and say, hey, validate. Is this a mention of a compound? Is this a mention of a protein? You do sort of need someone who's going to be at least basically familiar with those things. However, it is something that potentially even a general labeler could do. You won't get as reliable labels with a general labeler as with a domain expert. But you can apply these techniques to any sort of tagging based annotator. The other one I saw in here was the idea about finding edges or nodes that are not in the graph. So the link prediction. So finding edges is something that is definitely, I think, something that's doable. Finding missing nodes, it's a bit of a different thing. So the idea of finding a missing node is that the difficulty of that is that the graph space is not really a so essentially what finding a missing node would mean in a graph is I predict that this node should have an edge to some other node. And so in that case, you're actually predicting edge and node simultaneously. Because if you're just predicting a node in the ether, there's no real sort of like grasp on that. Because the graph space is not like a metric space of nodes. It's actually just the relationships between these entities. It is hypothetically possible to look at a area of a subgraph and say, you can hypothesize that, like, oh, there should be some algorithm to find a missing node that should be connecting these two things. The way I would go about doing that is that I would create a graph of second order relationships. So basically in this new graph, the edges would represent connections through another node. I would then do link prediction on that. And any edge that I can't identify with another node would potentially imply the existence of a missing node, in which case then you can look to see, oh, do I have a hole in my data set? Maybe such a node is actually not possible. So those are my thoughts on that. But it's a very sort of a hairy and much more difficult problem to predict missing nodes.
Yeah, because you'd argue like, hey, what if we did predict that? Maybe that node should actually be part of the graph.
Yeah,
eventually, right? So, yeah. Cool. Hey, Irene asks, hey, do you see other research work exploring AI-driven ways to generate and maintain knowledge graphs, or are you one of their companies? So there's definitely a lot of research that's happening right now in the knowledge graph space. It's very sort of nascent. People are starting to wake up to like knowledge graphs and like their importance, especially in the biomedical space. There might be other vendors doing it. They're definitely attempts, like, I don't know if they're all talking about it or at least doing it the way we're approaching it. For us, everything we do around Wisecube sort of like starts with like the knowledge graph, right? So there's so many other downstream applications and products that we're offered, but really the core idea is how do we build a target knowledge graph and then really extract insights from the knowledge graph and then power other applications and use cases using that. So in some ways, so that way we are different, but I'm sure other people are also looking at it because, like I said, it's a very active research area right now. Alex, do you want to add some color to that?
Yeah. So One of the things, there's often this ebb and flow, I think probably in general in AI, but sort of my knowledge would be more specific to NLP, where people come up with these like really outlandish expectations of NLP, and then we find that those are not realistic, and then we have more realistic expectations set. So I think the idea of producing a knowledge graph from a corpus of data, that's a much more tangible thing that NLP can do for letting people access huge amounts of information. If you look at some of the other approaches, sort of like, oh, can we build very competent question and answer machines? There's definitely research being done on that, but we're kind of far away from being able to do anything Star Trek level. Building a knowledge graph is just like it's a really reasonable way of letting people access the relationships in these entities produced from structured and unstructured data. And as you were mentioning earlier, Vishnu, from a machine learning or an AI point of view, all this text data is like dark matter. It's actually the majority of information. Most academic information, I'd say most information that humans produce, is for consumption by other humans in the form of language. That's how humans share information. Well, primarily how humans share information. So that information is, requires this, requires NLP to make it computable, and knowledge graphs actually produce relationships that are both human readable and computer readable, and it makes a lot of this data a lot more valuable.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And to me, the most exciting thing about it is it goes back to the idea of what Alex was talking about, is like, hey, you are, based on what company you keep, I can tell a lot about you. It's the same sort of contextual idea where, like, if you are ACE2, or if you are coronavirus, or if you're remdesivir, I have, by looking at the relationships that are around you and kinds of relationships you have, I can tell a lot about you. And that means I can create representations about that node, and then I can use those representations in obviously traditional deep learning and supervised learning methods to even add more context to that specific entity than otherwise possible, right? So that's what's so exciting to me about why we're all into like knowledge graphs, right? So hey, I think we're like almost like 13 minutes over time. Thanks for the great questions. This has been really exciting for us. This is the first time we did this, so we were a little like iffy about all the tech and stuff, but we're going to continue doing this. I think it's a great way for us to also share our knowledge and also get questions from people in the industry, the academia, to see what they're interested in as well. So we're definitely going to start doing more of these. So definitely keep an eye out on the channel, and also we'll let you know as new content pops up.
Yes, and in the future, I won't click on the lucid charts in the presentation.
Yes. Great. Thanks a lot, everyone. This has been awesome. Thanks a lot for staying late to people on the other side of the planet. Really appreciate all the questions and your attention. Thank you. See you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.